Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing your broader perspective, looking at speed of change, partnership, and also evidence-based research and what the government has been doing, and the international picture. And for Simon, giving us an account of the Fair Winds Charter and the way forward in terms of establishing an emissions control area, ECA, in this region. Now, perhaps, let's hear maybe from the audience. Any thoughts after listening to the presentations or keynote speeches? And also, if you have any questions, please also feel free to ask. Please identify yourself, your name and your affiliation. Any first comments? Yes. Dr. Colwell.
Yeah, Richard Colwell with BMT. We've started off hearing a lot about the ocean-going fuel switching. Can I ask for information for this this audience? What is the percentage of pollution from local vessels who have also had the change of their fuel against the ocean-going, and how we may improvements in that inventory as well?
My officers are here. Who would like to? There is Moman, Clara, even Tony, who's now moved to another department, but he worked on all of this before. Which one of you can help us answer that question? Moman, please.
The first question is how much emission from the ocean-going ships in Hong Kong? According to the latest inventory, 2013, as far as I can remember, it's about 50% SO2 is from the vessels. But of course, these vessels include ocean-going vessels and local vessels. And for the SO2, but for the RSP and the NOx, I can't remember the exact figure, but it should be some 35 to 36%, something like that. And the second question is, what is the reduction expected if we implemented the fuel switch regulation? And the reduction should be more than 60% while the ship is burping.
I think you asked a slightly different question, right? Yes, yes, yes. We do have the numbers. Simon said he remembers them all.
Well, now that's based on the basis will be 2007, but I don't think there will be a lot of difference in the last few years. If we compare ocean-going vessels emission, river vessels emissions, and local vessels emission, roughly for sulfur dioxide and for PM10, the ratio should be 70%, 20%, and 10%. Okay, so 70% from ocean-going vessels, 20% from river vessels, and 10% from local vessels. But when you want to talk about NOx, I think the ratios get closer, okay, because it's more related to the engine efficiency. If you want to single out VOC, then a lot of emissions are actually coming from local vessels, disproportionately.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Good morning. I'm Espen Richter Svensson, Norwegian Consul General in Guangzhou, just up the river. I was very encouraged to hear about what has been said here about the policy development. What I would like to hear a little bit more about is how you work with Chinese authorities, mainland authorities in these fields. Do you have sort of regular consultations? Do you have joint bodies looking into these things? I'm very curious. Thank you.
I think the answer is yes, 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 yes to all three questions. But to be honest, we're not able to go into the depths of those discussions at the moment because they actually involve many, many parties and many, many different ministries and departments also in China. But I think what you really want to know is, are we seriously speaking to each other, right? Now, I mean, obviously, when there are G2G discussion, government authorities talking to government authorities, first of all, is there an interest in the general policy direction? You know, are we just talking like we're talking about everything else, right? Or are we specifically looking at what to do with ships' emissions? So I think the answer is we're looking very specifically as a nation on ships' emissions. Secondly, is everybody who needs to be involved beginning to come into the room? Right? The answer is yes, because obviously there's not just the Ministry for the Environment, but the Ministry of Transportation. There are many players. There are many players. Are they being involved? Yes, the answer is yes. Are we having more and more regular discussions? Again, you know, the different exchanges, not just with Hong Kong, but there's a lot of discussions on the mainland by various mainland institutions. So the answer is yes, there's a lot of discussions.
If I may just add, other than the G2G discussion, there are a lot of non-G to non-G discussions as well. So for civic exchange, we're working very closely with universities in the mainland, with research institutions, to try to do more research with them and to share our experience.
Yeah, Mr. Poon.
I think there's a Joseph Poon from the TCC group. I think there's a lot to be said about the PPP model involving the private industry practitioners, for example, in particular. One of the things we talked about before the opening of conference was actually the difficulty of, let alone convergence of standards, you know, just to have some consistency or core consistency amongst different big regimes. I think it's very difficult, in particular, just with accounting or anything you talk about, is the US standard, the EU standard, and the rest of the world, and sometimes China comes in the picture. Is there any hope actually to help the poor ship owners who have to deal with all this with the same ship, I mean the same tank and other configurations, you know, doing global trade? You know, I mean, can you guys feel the pain that we are feeling? And is there any chance at all that people will talk and have some basic consistencies to help us navigate, not just the commercial reasons, but it's the risk imposed by different standards, really?
Well, I must say, you and I need to talk more. Yes, at the meeting in Hamburg, what was interesting about that was that all the different people with their different levels of joy and pain were there. Then obviously, you know, I mean, a conference, an open conference is like this, but actually what we need to do specifically is to understand the specific pains and problems of all the different players. So I think at this stage, because if we go along with Simon, your picture, right, then what's the next few years going to be about? What do we need as policymakers? Because I think there are a number of critical parties that need to understand each other better. So if China is going to go for a CECA, ICA, you know, a bigger national stage for this, what is it that you want the different authorities to understand about your pain? And I think what you're probably saying is, how can you communicate your pain more effectively with us? So I think we need to perhaps set up some meetings to better understand your message, because you want to get at the more technical level now. Yes, no, I understand what you're saying. You know, maybe I can just pull back and talk about co-learning and collaboration. We have had this experience in Hong Kong, but it took quite a lot of time. In the government, we've become more and more used to doing what we call stakeholder engagements. And the stakeholder engagement is precisely to talk about all the different issues that we don't necessarily understand. And your concern is the different players who have to make adjustments and investments in the long term to comply with whatever policy makers are thinking. You want to have a good discussion beforehand. So how can we achieve that now that mainland China is interested in exploring this issue? Maybe this is a subject that Shanghai, Shenzhen, ourselves can also take back. Now, I suspect that on the mainland, because you know it's also new for the Hong Kong government, right, to do this kind of more close stakeholder engagement, how we can perhaps replicate some of that where the messages can reach the mainland authorities. I personally think that's very important, how we make that work. We need also friends, and we need probably the shipping and port sector to also use your contacts on the mainland to get your message through. So I think my advice is, you know many, many people too. How can the shipping sector be more strategic now that you know the door is open on the subject, to use your influence to make sure that your concerns are understood and taken into account?
Captain, please.
Vinay from TCC Group. I hear percentages mentioned about the emission from ships. It somehow conflicts with the earlier study conducted by IMO on the greenhouse gas emissions. The numbers released by IMO a few years ago was the greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions were maximized by land-based industries, such as power generation itself cost 35%, the roadways 21%, and the manufacturing industry released about 18%, whereas the coastal shipping was credited with about 15%. Surprisingly low was the airline 4% and ocean shipping 3% only. Others, such as housewives cooking at home and all that, was about 4%. How do you compare the ship emission from ships which come into Hong Kong harbor as against the land-based pollution which is on record? Are there any aggressive steps taken to curtail or identify or reverse that process?
Let me try to understand the question. Is, do we know what is the CO2 contribution from the marine sector? From land-based, yes. We do have an emissions inventory in Hong Kong for, my officer is here, on climate change. So Hong Kong actually has quite an extensive emissions inventory on CO2. Tony, would you like to see what you can say that may be useful?
You're actually, the EPD has just updated the emission inventory for our greenhouse gas emissions in Hong Kong. We just did the update last Friday. Yeah, you can go to our website to take a look. Well, actually, the greatest emitters, the greatest source of greenhouse gases in Hong Kong is from the power generation. It accounts for about 68% of our greenhouse gas emissions altogether. And the second sector is the transport. When we talk about transport, we mean mainly the on-road transport, that is the on-road vehicles, plus some of the those marine vessels operating within the territories within the waters of Hong Kong. But this is restricted to local vessels only. We don't count the ocean-going vessels. And the third sector will be the waste from the waste. That is, well, let's say the waste landfills in the 3 mega landfills in Hong Kong. So do I answer your question, or?
I think the reason we're not, maybe you can explain why we're not counting international shipping.
Yeah, well, it's an international practice that for the local emission inventory on greenhouse gases, we don't count the ocean-going vessels, and we don't count those airlines flying the international lines, international routes. It's an international practice, but we understand that there are ongoing studies somewhere by the academics about this issue. Well, there are some saying that, well, why don't you count the emissions of those international airlines and international and the ocean-going vessels when they are navigating within the area, within the zones of Hong Kong? Well, we know there are some academic studies going on, but for the inventory itself, we don't count these sources.
The inventory, the reason we're doing it this way, it's because some of it is counted elsewhere. Right? So therefore, the industry and the global perspective of what comes from aviation and what comes from shipping, that's the sort of overall number that is available.
Yes, the gentleman at the back, please.
My name is Peter Ng, a retired soldier in shipping. I'd like to pose two questions. Maybe I read the not in good enough. The cruise terminal in Kai Tak, I learned that the shore-based electricity supply project is shelved. I'm probably wrong, okay? Because I look at the cruise ships, more and more they will come to Hong Kong. So I think a shore-based electricity supply makes a lot of sense versus the health bills that we are going to shoulder, okay? The second question is, I'd like to know whether this July 1st legislation will imply also to Ocean Terminal and Kai Tak and all the berth area or not. Thank you.
Well, the second question is very easy. The answer is yes. It applies to everybody. It applies to all ocean-going vessels. The second question about the cruise terminal is, it's not shelved, it's temporarily, we're not taking a decision to put it in right now. The reason is, we're not at the stage in Hong Kong where there are ships coming. The cruise, as I said, there are two aspects to it. One is environmental, reducing emissions. Another one is the more business side. Right now, our cruise industry is still at a very, very initial stage. Now, the problem is, if we were to spend quite a considerable sum of public money to put in onshore power today, where maybe it won't be used even once in a year, that's a problem from a public expenditure point of view. So what we're interested in, and this is outside our control in environmental protection, we're interested to look at the potential growth of the cruise industry in Hong Kong. The second thing is, are there ships that are coming that are onshore powered enabled? So our research looked at what is the near-term projection of the vessels that might be coming to Hong Kong, the number of cruisers and the type of cruisers that are coming, and how many of them might be onshore powered enabled. And the number is extraordinarily small. So the other thing that has also happened today, and again, we want to learn from the international sector, is another type of technology that ships seem to be interested in, which is the scrubbers. Some cruising companies seem to be now investing in scrubber technology because they can meet ECR standards. Now, of course, that's different from onshore power because onshore power is zero emission. But if these cruisers can meet ECR standards in Europe, it seems like a number of the big companies are willing to invest in that. Now, at this moment in time, we can't quite completely see what might be the future picture. Is it that if these companies are going to invest in scrubbers, they're not going to invest in onshore power? So that means perhaps even less ships in the cruiser areas are going to be OPS enabled. So at this moment in time, the question for the government is, do I make this investment now? Or do I watch a little bit more to see what may be the trend? So when we say shelf, it doesn't mean it's going into a drawer never to be brought up again. But it does depend on how fast our cruise industry is going to go, and the cruise industry itself, what kind of ships are they going to bring to Hong Kong? So I hope that explains our position. There is a paper that we put to LegCo to explain this.
This is Michael from Caterpillar Marine, the engine and the propulsion systems provider. As you know, from the recent decade, marine power system industry have been developing very fast. There's a lot of change in technology and the solutions to help reduce the emissions. But to be honest, those technology and the innovative solutions come with cost. So I would like to know, is there any plan for the government to subsidize or finance those end users to encourage them to use the technologies and the solutions?
I'm sorry, what kind of end users?
The ship owners.
I think very difficult. I think extremely difficult.
Okay.
Yeah, so what we've done is the incentive scheme to those shipping companies that were doing fuel switching at berth in Hong Kong. So that's probably about as far as we can go. But I think your question was about new technology, new investments that that is not just to cover a part of the cost of the cleaner fuel.
Yeah.
Now, if it
Beyond
is
that.
just to cover the cost of the cleaner fuel, then Hong Kong's subsidy scheme in place since 2012, from the end of 2012, then that is now going to be extended till 2018, right? So in Hong Kong, for all the ships that are going to switch fuels, and hopefully all the ones that are going to switch fuels, right, on the 1st of July, if they think this sum of money is important to them, then they'll apply. But what's interesting is, I think some people are switching fuels and they never applied for the subsidy because, you know, it's a bit of a hassle as well. And for government to use, right, it's a hassle. I mean, applying for subsidies from any government is going to be a hassle. So now the question is, we in using taxpayers' money, I can only offer to cover, right, an amount that is real. So ours is going to be, you know, about 30 to 50% of the actual cost of the fuel switch. Now in Shenzhen, I think Shenzhen is a bit more generous, right? Shenzhen is willing to go for 80 to 100%. But again, maybe that sum of money isn't attractive enough to the shipping companies to bother with the application. But in any case, in Hong Kong, now that it's mandated, everybody has to do it. And for my officers, they've been planning on enforcement. So, you know, Simon, you sort of say, well, this is the end of the story, right? Let's go for ICA. Just a reminder that if you're in government, our next step is enforcement, which means we have to create a group of officers. They're going to learn how to climb up and down ships, right? We've had the US EPA officers, I think, helping my officers to understand how they are doing it. We need to have a long-term plan of how to pick ships to go on, right? So because the legislature already said that after 6 months of implementing this enforcement plan, and because it's new in Hong Kong, we don't wake up and know how to do it, right? My officers have to learn and practice and so on. Then the legislature rightly wants a kind of report to see how we're doing. So that's on a very practical end. At the substantive enforcement end, that's what my colleagues are getting ready for. Now, of course, at the same time, we're also getting ready and participating in the thinking policy end of a much bigger picture in mainland China.
Looking at the time, we'll have time for one more question. Gentlemen, please.
My name is Stanley Lai from CMA CGM, as one of the carrier participating in the Fairing Charter. We are very encouraged to see the development of the Hong Kong government plans for civil exchange for the leaderships. Concerning about the legislations, which now we have already a level playing field. To just touch upon on the incentive we're just talking about, I think it's a very, very good motivation for the carrier to steer the way to engage in this program, even though it's not covering the full cost. I recall when we talk about the legislations or the roadmap, there has been some discussion about the 0.5% or the 0.1% which we should pursue. which right now the regulation is talking about 0.5%. Is there any further initiative from the government sector or wherever to try to promote more for the carriers to move from 0.5 to 0.1? Of course, I mean, from the carrier perspective, there's a cost element behind the scenes. So right now, we got already the incentive to kind of mitigate or subsidize the cost which we pay additional. But right now, actually, a lot of carriers, they're also technically viable to burn fuels even further down below the thresholds to 0.1%. So is there any consideration, I know it's a taxpayer money, but is there any consideration from the government to further review, to give additional incentive for those players who are able to burn lower percentage of fuel, so it can give more tangible impact to the community?
Well, I'm very interested in that question. I mean, from an environmental point of view, the answer is, of course, yes. And you will remember why we went for 0.5. We went for 0.5 in the legislation because there was also a lot of discussion about whether there would be sufficient 0.1 fuel. Now, we know that time is passing and there'll be more cleaner fuel. And you'll remember this discussion that we all had about whether there'll be enough fuel when in the US and in Europe, the ECA bites in for 0.1 fuel. Now, from a government perspective, we'd like the fuel to be as clean as possible. So the 0.5 was an agreement that we reached with the industry because 0.5 was believed to be much more available, so that we won't get into a situation where we passed a piece of legislation and somehow the market says, well, we can't get enough 0.1 fuel. Now, I also understand that there is a discussion also on the mainland about sufficiency of 0.1 fuel. So what I'd like to do, again, is to be guided by you on this. Now, now that we've passed the legislation, if we wanted to change the legislation and have 0.1, that's relatively simple. That's relatively simple. Of course, we need to go through the whole legislative process again to explain to people, go to the legislature and make a change. But like with the fuel switching at birth legislation, we were able to go to the legislature with the industry, where the industry said we're fully behind this. So there was no additional query from the legislators as to whether there's a lot of objection in the community. So I think if the shipping sector, if the oil suppliers, if you were to say to us that, you know, by a certain time, we shouldn't even have to worry about the availability of 0.1 fuel, would be prepared to change the law. Now, obviously, I think your question also says, if some carriers today are already willing to use 0.1, should we consider a system like the one Shenzhen is putting forward, where there is additional incentive for those who are willing to use cleaner fuel? That's a different question, because I think Financial Secretary wanted to be simple about it, right? But in any case, the bigger question is, we'll have to change the law to go for 0.1. And we're willing to do that. But let us know that the fuel is going to be readily available.
Well, thank you. Very positive messages in terms of government's willingness to move ahead in a more aggressive manner. So perhaps I'll end this session right now. And thank you so much, Christine and Simon, for sharing the insights and answering the questions. And then I'm going to have my colleague to instruct us what the next step is. Thank you.